Okay, so first I want to thank Venerable Kai Yin for inviting me to give a talk to his class on the Pali Commentaries. And I'm also very delighted to know that he's using the Chinese translation of the commentary to the Sabbasava Sutta for this class, since my dear student Zhuang Bohui translated this with a lot of trouble. And I'm glad to see that this work of hers is being used, good use is being made of it. As Venerable Xuan-Zang said, the style of the commentaries is not exactly the most exciting type of literature to be reading. There's nothing in it like a detective novel or romance novel. But for understanding early Buddhism, the commentaries are very useful. And I believe, my own belief is that the commentaries that we have that have come down in the Pali tradition are the end products, the results of a long and gradual process of development. And so before I discuss some of the special features of the Pali commentaries, I want to speak a bit about the stages in the development of the commentaries. And when we look at the suttas, the discourses of the Buddha, we could find that there are suttas which provide commentaries on statements or discourses of the Buddha. Sometimes we find the Buddha comments on his own terminology, explains his own terminology. An example of this, probably all of you will know the formula, the 12-factored formula of dependent origination, of that ignorance is the condition for sankharas, sankharas the condition for vijnana or consciousness, and so on. Okay, so we find this formula in many, many suttas, but there is a sutta in the Samyutta Nikaya. It's Samyutta Nikaya chapter 12, sutta number 2, called the Vibhanga Sutta, the analysis of dependent origination. And in the sutta, the Buddha takes each of the 12 terms in the formula and gives a definition. For example, he raises the question, what is old age and death? And then first he'll break old age and death into two parts, old age. Then he raises the question, what is old age? Then he gives a number of synonyms for old age. Then he'll take death and give a number of synonyms for death, then join them together to make old age and death. And in this way, he'll go back to birth, to existence, and so on, all the ways back to ignorance, giving the definitions of each of those terms. So we could say that the Vibhanga Sutta is a commentary by the Buddha himself on the factors of dependent origination. Another sutta that fits into this category, where the Buddha comments on his own terminology, is found in the Suttas on the Noble Eightfold Path. This is Samyutta Nikaya, chapter 45, sutta number 8, which gives formal definitions of each of the 8 factors of the Noble Path. So this sutta will first, it enumerates the Noble Eightfold Path, right view, right intention, all the ways through to right concentration. Then it raises the question, what is right view? Then it gives the explanation, knowledge of suffering, knowledge of its origin, knowledge of its cessation, knowledge of the path. And in this way, it goes through each of the 8 factors down to right concentration. Okay, sometimes we find in the suttas that the Buddha will make a short statement and then he gets up from his seat and leaves. And the monks don't understand the statement of the Buddha. And so they'll ask each other, did you understand it? No, I didn't understand. Did you understand? No, I didn't understand. So what are we going to do? In this case, the monks will go to another monk who's very knowledgeable about the Dharma, and they will repeat the statement from the Buddha, and they'll say, what is the meaning of this? Please explain to us. The monk who is foremost in this skill of explaining the short statements of the Buddha was named Mahakachayana or Mahakachana. So he gave explanations of the Buddha's short statements. In the Majjhima Nikaya, we find 3 suttas like this. Majjhima Nikaya Sutta number 18, Majjhima Nikaya Sutta number 138, in which Mahakachana comments on a brief statement by the Buddha. Then there's another sutta in which the Buddha speaks a poem, and then he leaves without explaining the poem. And then the monks come to Mahakachana and ask him the meaning of the poem, and Mahakachana will explain the meaning of the poem. So we could see here in the suttas that some monks give commentaries on statements of the Buddha. And so this is indicating that even in this very early period, the monks recognized the importance of having detailed, clear explanations of short and difficult, obscure statements by the Buddha. Okay, over time, there emerged certain works that have the flavor of commentaries. These are not the actual atthakatha, not what we call the commentaries today, but these are works that have the nature of commentaries, but they were composed early enough to be included in the Pali canon. And there are 2 works like this. They're both called the Nidesa, but one of them is larger, so it is called the Maha-Nidesa. The word Nidesa means something like maybe shuoming, explanation, elaboration. So the great Maha-Nidesa is a kind of word commentary on words that occur in the 4th chapter of a book called the Suttanipāta, a collection of suttas, mainly in poetry, included in the Sutta Pitaka. So the Maha-Nidesa comments on the poems of chapter number 4 in the Suttanipāta, and the other Nidesa, the Chula Nidesa, maybe we could call this the Xiao Shuoming, the little explanation, gives explanations of chapter 5 in the Suttanipāta. And I'll give you some examples of the way the Nidesas give their explanations. So in the chapter 4 of the Suttanipāta, the first line says, for a person who desires sensual pleasures. So the Pali uses the word kama. The word means sensual pleasures. Then the Mahanidesa quotes the line, and then it will give an explanation. It says, there are two, it raises the question, what are sensual pleasures? Then it says, there are two kinds of sensual pleasures: sensual pleasures as objects and sensual pleasures as defilements. Then it raises the question, what are sensual pleasures as objects? Then it gives the answer. Delightful forms, delightful sounds, delightful odors, tastes, touch objects, desirable possessions, and so on and so on. Okay, so this might make it easier to follow. Okay, so then the Nidesa raises the question, what are sensual pleasures as defilements? Then it gives the answer: sensual desire, sensual lust, sensual thoughts, sensual craving, sensual delight, and so forth. Another example from the Chula Nidesa. This is the little Nidesa, the commentary on the 5th chapter of the Suttanipāta. I'll just copy and paste them. Okay, so this, okay, so a Brahmin, a young Brahmin comes to the Buddha and asks about suffering, like what is the nature, what is it that the world fears? And the Buddha says, his answer is that the world is afraid of dukkha, of suffering. So the Chula Nidesa picks up the word dukkha, suffering, and raises the question, what is dukkha? And then it gives the answer: the suffering of birth, the suffering of old age, the suffering of disease, suffering of death, suffering of sorrow, weeping, pain, misery, and despair, the suffering of hell, the suffering of the animals, the suffering in the realm of ghosts, human suffering, and so on. Then it mentions the different types of suffering due to eye disease, ear disease, nose disease, tongue disease, and so on and so forth. So you could see in this way how the method of the commentary is starting to take shape already in this period, which might be sometime around the 1st or 2nd century BC, after the time of the Nikayas, but before the actual Attakatas have emerged. Okay, now when we speak about commentaries, the Pali commentaries, what we are referring to, the word that is used is Attakata. And the word Attakata is a compound of the word Atta, which means the meaning, and Kata is a discussion. So the Attakata are discussions of the meaning of the text. And so now we have commentaries to each of the major Nikayas. There's a Digha Nikaya commentary, Majjhima Nikaya commentary, Samyutta Nikaya commentary, Anguttara Nikaya commentary. Then the books of the Khuddaka Nikaya each have their own commentaries. And then there's the commentary to the Vinaya, that's the monastic discipline. and several commentaries to the Abhidharma Pitaka. So those are the commentaries that we have at present. And these commentaries probably developed over a long period in several stages. So first, there would have been ancient commentaries that would have been composed in India, probably starting in the early generations after the time of the Buddha, maybe even from the 5th century BC, 4th century BC. And it's said that when the first Indian missionaries came from India to Sri Lanka, they brought these commentaries with them. And those commentaries would have been probably preserved in one of the ancient North Indian languages, perhaps in Pali, the Pali language. But they were translated into the old language of Sri Lanka, the Sinhalese language. But then within Sri Lanka, other commentaries were composed, which are called the Sinhala commentaries. But neither the old Indian commentaries nor the Sri Lankan commentaries survived down to the present. But what happened is that in the 5th century, a monk from South India by the name of Buddhaghosa came to Sri Lanka for the purpose of studying the commentaries and translating them into Pali so that they would be comprehensible, so that they could be understood by the monks in India. And Buddhaghosa claims that he composed the Pali commentaries on the basis of the old Indian commentaries, the old Indian Atthakatha, which had been translated into the old Sinhalese language and preserved in Sri Lanka. And so Buddhaghosa, according to in his commentaries, he said that he took the essence of those old commentaries and translated them into the language of the canonical texts, the language that we now call Pali. But Buddhaghosa also composed another work of his own, which is not strictly a commentary, but it is a work which serves as the foundation for the Pali commentaries. That work is called the Visuddhimagga, the path of purification. And this work draws a lot of material from the commentaries, but it puts that material together into a sequence which follows the 3 main stages of the path of Sila, Samadhi, and Panya. So starting with the explanation of Sila or moral practice, and under the heading of Samadhi, Buddhaghosa explains the 40 meditation objects that lead to Samadhi. Then under the heading of Panya, he explains the primary doctrines of early Buddhism, the nature of the 5 aggregates, the 12 sense bases, the 18 elements, the 4 noble truths, and dependent origination. And then he explains the sequence of stages in the development of insight up to the attainment of the higher realizations of the paths, the fruits, and liberation. Okay, so now I want to discuss some of the special features of the commentaries. And I have to admit that when I was planning this talk, even just a few days ago, I was wondering, how do I give a talk in 1 hour on the importance of the commentaries, since the commentaries contain so much information? So how do I treat this very big topic? So I thought just to select a few features of the commentaries which will show their value. So one feature that we find in the commentaries is that it classifies the suttas according to the origin of the suttas. Why? So it tries to answer the question, why did the Buddha speak this sutta? Because if we look at the sutta, we can't see the reason. We can't always see the reason. And so the commentaries will divide the suttas into 4 types based on the way they originate, based on the reason the Buddha spoke those suttas. So the first reason is that the Buddha will explain or give a sutta based on his own inclination, because he thinks it's important to give the sutta. So without being asked by others, he'll simply speak to the monks. Usually it's the monks. He'll say, monks, I'm going to teach you about this. I'm going to teach you about that. And then he'll give the sutta. So some examples, the Sabbasava Sutta, the simile of the cloth, the Satipatthana Sutta, and many, many suttas on dependent origination, the 5 aggregates, the Noble Eightfold Path, and so on. The Buddha just gives those on his own. The second type of sutta is a sutta that originates because of the inclinations or needs of others. So in this case, the Buddha might see that a disciple needs a particular teaching, and so then he will give a discourse in order to help that disciple. An example of this would be the first sermon of the Buddha, the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, in which case the Buddha gave that discourse the way he did in order to explain the Dhamma to the first 5 disciples, the 5 ascetics. So the 5 ascetics had rejected the Buddha, thinking that he had returned to a life of luxury, that he was indulging his desires. And so the Buddha gave the Dhammacakka Sutta to explain that he didn't return to a life of luxury, but he was following the middle path. Another example of this is a discourse that the Buddha gave to Rahula, his son, in order to help Rahula attain arhatship. This is Majjhima Nikaya, number 147. And then there are many other suttas that we see, particularly in the Samyutta Nikaya, where a monk will come to the Buddha and say, Venerable, please give me a teaching so that I can go off into seclusion and meditate on my own. And then the Buddha will give that monk a teaching. So this is a discourse given because of the inclinations of others. The third type of discourse is a discourse given in response to a question. So this is the discourse we see when people come to the Buddha, they will ask a question, and the Buddha responds with a discourse. So an example of this, there are many, many examples of this, but a good example, very long sutta, is found in the Digha Nikaya, Sutta number 2, the Samanyapala Sutta. In this sutta, the king of the state of Magadha, Ajatasattu, comes to the Buddha and asks, what are the benefits of the monastic life? Why should a person become a monastic? And then the Buddha will explain the entire process of the monastic training up to the jhanas, the higher knowledges, and then the different stages of liberation. And so in this way, the Buddha's discourse answers the question of the king. Okay, the fourth type of discourse is called the discourse given because of a particular incident. And so this is where something happens. There's some kind of background story. And in response to that background story, the Buddha gives the discourse. So sometimes we can see the background story in the sutta itself. An example of this is the first sutta in the Digha Nikaya, the Brahmajala Sutta. So at the beginning of the sutta, the Buddha and the monks are walking along a highway, and in front of them, there is a Brahmin and his student. And the Brahmin is speaking criticism of the Buddha and the Sangha. And the Brahmin's student is praising the Buddha and the Sangha. And so the Buddha starts the Brahmajala Sutta in response to this condition where the Buddha himself and the Sangha are being praised by some and criticized by others. Another sutta that arises due to a particular incident, in which the incident is described in the sutta itself, is the famous discourse on the simile of the saw. So in this case, there was a monk named Paguna who was being criticized by the other monks. And when he was criticized, he would become angry. And so the Buddha gave the simile of the saw to speak about how a monk should never become angry when others criticize him. Okay, another example in which the background story lies, it can be seen in the sutta itself, is the Mahanidana Sutta. In this sutta, the beginning of this sutta, the Venerable Ananda comes to the Buddha and says, even though dependent origination is said to be very deep and hard to see, for me, it seems easy to understand. Then the Buddha says, do not speak in that way, Ananda. Do not speak in that way. This dependent origination is very difficult, very hard to understand. And then the Buddha will give the discourse on dependent origination. Okay, but sometimes the background story to the sutta doesn't appear in the sutta itself. And in these cases, the commentary provides the background story. It explains the reason why the Buddha spoke that sutta. So a good example of this is the first sutta in the Majjhima Nikaya, the Mulapariyaya Sutta. So if we look at the sutta, it just begins, the Buddha addresses the monks and says, I will teach you the discourse on the root, and then the Buddha starts to speak. But the commentary tells us, but when we read the Mulapariyaya Sutta, what we find at the end of the sutta is, the end of the sutta says that when the Buddha finished speaking, the monks did not delight in his discourse. And that seems very strange, because almost every sutta will end by saying that the monks or the people delighted in the word of the Blessed One. So why didn't the monks delight in the word of the Buddha? So the commentary explains that there were 500 or a large number of Brahmins who were impressed by the Buddha, and they went forth, they got ordained, and they became monks. But after learning the Buddha's teachings, they became very proud and thought that they had mastered the teaching and didn't have to go to listen to the Buddha teach anymore. And so the Buddha thought, if these monks remain very proud and arrogant and don't come to listen to my discourses, they're not going to develop in the Dharma. So I have to give them a discourse that's going to break their pride. And so the Buddha spoke the Mulapariyaya Sutta in order to break the pride of those former Brahmins who had become monks. And that, the commentary explains, that's why they didn't delight in the teaching of the Buddha. Okay, so these are four origins of the sutta. And usually we find at the beginning of a sutta, the beginning of the commentary on the sutta, the commentary will explain the reason the Buddha gave that sutta. It will raise the question, what is the origin of the sutta? And then it will explain the origin. This is also another interesting feature in the commentaries. There are some texts in the canon, in the Pali canon, preserved in verse. And behind each of these verses, there's said to be a story. But we don't find the story in the canonical text. But in order to find the story, we have to turn to the commentary. For example, everybody probably knows the Dhammapada. So in the Theravada tradition, it's said that each verse of the Dhammapada was spoken because of a particular incident. There's some story behind the verse. And then the commentary will tell the story that explains the verse. And then in the Suttanipāta, there's a famous poem, a long sutta called the Sutta on the Horn of the Rhinoceros. And it's said that each of these verses was spoken by a Pacceka Buddha. And it's said that there was a background story to each of the verses, and the commentary will relate a long background story about how a particular Pacceka Buddha spoke that verse. The commentaries also give us biographies of the great disciples of the Buddha, and we find these particularly in the commentary to the Anguttara Nikaya. So these are biographies that usually go back into past lives, and they start by showing the time when that disciple first made the resolve, the vow, to become a great disciple of the Buddha. And so the commentaries include a very rich literature of stories about the Buddha and his disciples. Okay, now coming to another important function of the commentaries is to give explanations of the words, of terms. And it's one of the functions of the commentary to explain every word occurring in the sutta. Sometimes even ordinary words are explained, but special attention is given to words that have some kind of doctrinal importance. An example of this is the word Tathagata, which of course in Chinese you have Ru Lai. So this is a designation for the Buddha, which occurs very often. And so the Digani commentary raises the question, what is the meaning of the word Tathagata? And then it gives 8 explanations of the word Tathagata. So the best known is he's called the Tathagata because he has thus come. And then another reason is he has thus gone. And then it will explain each of these expressions by bringing various doctrinal concepts to clarify them. And then the Visuddhimagga will give explanations of the 9 designations or 9 qualities of the Buddha. For example, we have the Buddha is called Arahang, Sammasambuddho, Vijacharana Sampanno. So the Visuddhimagga will raise the question, why is he called Arahang? And then it will give several explanations of the word Arahang. Then it will raise the question, why is he called Sammasambuddho? Then it will give an explanation of Sammasambuddho, and so on. And so if we want to understand these words occurring in the sutta text, the commentary will help us to understand the direct meaning of the word and the implications of the word. Another example of this, of how the commentary gives word explanations, is in relation to, there's a sutta called the Simile of the Cloth, which mentions 16 upakilesa, 16 defilements. And the meaning of some of these terms is not clear from the suttas themselves. But this is where the commentary comes in helpful by giving definitions of these terms. I was going to take some examples of this. Okay, maybe I should just move on. Okay, sometimes the commentary will take a word that occurs with different meanings in different contexts, and then it will explain the different meanings, and it will refer to the canonical texts where those meanings occur. One example is the word Dhamma, of course, the most common word in the Buddhist texts. And so the Majjhima commentary explains that the word Dhamma can mean the scriptures, it can mean the Four Noble Truths, it can mean samadhi, wisdom, nature, the nature of things, phenomena, merit, things that can be known, and so forth. Another example, the word brahmacharya, which we usually translate the holy life. And the Suttanipāta commentary explains that this word can mean abstinence from sex, or it can mean the Noble Eightfold Path, or it can mean meditation practice, or it can mean the sasana, the teaching as a whole. A good example that you will come to when you're studying the Sabbasava Sutta, let me just So in the Sabasava Sutta, the key word is asava. And so the commentary will raise the question, what is meant by the asavas? And then it explains first, it uses the verb to explain, asavanti, they flow. And then it gives the explanation that they flow through the eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind, or they flow throughout all the different realms of existence. Therefore, they are called asavas, and so on. And sometimes the commentary will give the explanation of a word that is not correct. So the commentary, not 100% reliable in its word explanations. So one example of this that I have is the explanation of the word nibbana, the Pali word nibbana, which of course in Sanskrit is nirvana. So the commentary explains nibbana as the absence of craving, which is compared to a jungle or a forest. So that is a kind of playful explanation, but the real meaning of nibbana is derived from the verb nibbayati, to go out, to be extinguished, which is said of a fire. Okay, now I want to look at some of the doctrinal developments in the commentaries and taking as a basis the Four Noble Truths and the four tasks regarding the Four Noble Truths. If you're familiar with the first discourse of the Buddha says that each of the Four Noble Truths has a particular task to be performed. So the first noble truth, the truth of dukkha or suffering, is to be fully understood. The second noble truth, which is the origin of suffering, is to be abandoned. The third noble truth, which is nibbana, the cessation of suffering, is to be realized. And the fourth noble truth, the path, is to be cultivated, to be developed. Now, the commentaries take these terms and elaborate upon them. They give more detailed explanations of them. So it's said that the first noble truth is parinyaya. It's to be fully understood. And so the commentaries develop a theory, or they make a distinction of three kinds of full understanding, three kinds of parinya. So first, so in order to fully understand the first noble truth, we have to pass through these three stages of full understanding. So first is full understanding of the known, which means knowing the various phenomena included in the five aggregates by way of their lakkhana, their specific characteristic. For example, we have the five aggregates. The first is the aggregate of material form. Material form consists of the four primary elements. And so we have to examine the four elements, each by way of its characteristic. Similarly, for feeling, perception, volitional activities, consciousness, to know, to gain this full understanding of the known, we have to examine the five aggregates and understand them in terms of their special characteristics, and also understand the conditions for each of the five aggregates. So that is full understanding of the known. But then one has to go on to the next stage, which is called Tirana Parinya, which I would translate full understanding through investigation. At this stage, one has to understand the five aggregates by way of their general characteristics. Those are the three universal characteristics of anicca, dukkha, anatta: impermanence, suffering, and non-self. And then the third stage of full understanding is called the full understanding through abandoning, which means abandoning wrong ideas or misconceptions about the conditioned phenomena by gaining insight into their true nature. That is, eliminating the wrong notion of permanence through direct insight into impermanence, eliminating the wrong idea of pleasure through direct insight into dukkha or suffering, eliminating the misconception of a self by gaining direct insight into the truth of non-self, and so on. So this is the way that one fully understands the first noble truth. Okay, then it said that the second noble truth, and the second noble truth is craving, or we could say more broadly, all the defilements. So the second noble truth is to be abandoned, to be eliminated. Here I'm just going to jump down. So the commentary will explain three kinds of abandonment, three ways in which one abandons defilements. So one of these is abandoning in a particular respect. So the way I would understand this is that when one finds that a particular defilement has arisen in the mind, one uses a particular, maybe subject of contemplation to remove that defilement, to remove that defilement temporarily. So for example, if sensual lust arises, then I might use the meditation on the impure nature of the body to remove the sensual lust. If hatred arises, I might use loving kindness to temporarily remove the hatred. If doubt arises, then I might use some investigation to remove the doubt. So this is abandoning in a particular respect. The next is called abandoning by suppression. And this means by gaining deep samadhi, particularly the jhanas, the defilements are suppressed so that they do not arise and become active in the mind. So they get pushed down to a very quiet level. But suppression is not the same as the elimination of the defilements. So the third type of abandoning is by eradication. This is by eliminating the defilements completely. And that is done by the wisdom of the path. So when the when the world transcending path arises, then it cuts off the defilements so that they can never arise again. Okay, so this is an idea that's developed in the commentaries, the three kinds of abandoning. Okay, the third noble truth, or nibbana, is to be realized. And then the commentary, the sutta, say that the fourth noble truth, which is the path, is to be developed. And what's interesting is that the commentaries speak about two kinds of development, or two kinds of path. They make a distinction between the mundane path or worldly path and the world transcending path. And you might think that the mundane path means that you are just doing good meritorious deeds, like practicing generosity, worshiping the Buddha, giving alms to the monks, organizing Dhamma talks, and so on. And then you might think that the practice of insight meditation is the world transcending path, but actually the commentaries use these terms in a more technical sense. So the way the commentaries make the distinction between the mundane path and the world transcending path. They say that the mundane path includes the path or the practice of insight meditation, even the highest stages of insight meditation, because insight takes the five aggregates as its object, and whatever has conditioned phenomena as its object is part of the mundane path. So the world transcending path is identified only with the four momentary states of path consciousness. That is, when one practices insight meditation and goes through the higher stages of insight, at a certain point, a state of consciousness arises just for one moment that takes nibbana as its object. And that consciousness, that state of mind, has the function of eradicating defilements. And that is called the world transcending path. And so this is a new development in the commentaries, the idea of the world transcending path as lasting only for a single moment, a single mind moment. And so this world transcending path arises for one moment, and then it's followed by a few other mind moments, which are called the fruits or fruition. So this is a new concept, a new type of interpretation, quite different from the idea of the path and fruits in the Nikayas. In the Nikayas, one gets the idea that the Noble Eightfold Path is something that one practices gradually, a step-by-step path that one practices in one's everyday life. And then when that practice reaches its culmination, its high point, then one starts to eliminate the defilements. But the way the commentaries based on the Abhidhamma interpret the Noble Eightfold Path, they take the Noble Eightfold Path to be that single mind moment which takes Nibbana as its object. And it's said that the mind moment of the path performs four functions. The path consciousness directly experiences Nibbana, taking Nibbana as its object, but it understands the first noble truth, the truth of suffering, and it abandons or eradicates the second noble truth, which is craving and the other defilements, and it develops the path by bringing up the 8 factors of the Noble Eightfold Path. And the Visuddhimagga compares this to a lamp that performs 4 functions, that is, sheds light, removes darkness, consumes the oil, and burns the wick. I was going to give some examples of how the commentaries use this scheme of explanation to interpret passages in the suttas, but I think I see that I'm taking more time than I thought I would take, and I think we should leave some time for questions. So maybe I should stop my presentation now. And I think I made this file available to Venerable Xuan-Zang, so she could share this file with the people who registered for the course, and then you could see the examples where the commentaries use this scheme as a method of interpretation.